Kairatipantes, welcome back to Greek. Today we're doing lesson 10, which is the imperfect active indicative. So far we've done the present and future, so now we're starting to look at what was happening in the past, more specifically actions that aren't yet completed or are still occurring, but started in the past. It works just the same as in Latin, so if you understand how the imperfect tense is translated from Latin to English, you will catch on to Greek very quickly. And then we're going to be looking at something called the temporal augment, which is very important to the imperfect tense in Greek, and it sounds scarier than it is, I promise. We're basically going to be learning how to convert vowels into other vowels or diphthongs that we need for the imperfect tense. I promise it'll make sense in just a bit. And then at the end of the lesson, we'll be doing our 8th vocab set, which I made pretty short this week because the imperfect tense can be a little bit hefty to understand at first, and I wanted you to really focus on that rather than learning a ton of new vocab words. And then at the very end of the lesson, we'll be doing a teaser, as always, for next week's lesson. And this time, we'll be doing a passive verb sentence. So far we've only done active, and now we're moving into the passive and the middle voice. Middle voice is something specific to Greek, so that'll be new for everyone, and we'll be doing that next week. So, something to look forward to. And now, let's get into our imperfect endings. So first, we'll start as always with the first person singular ending, and that for imperfect is on, omicron nu. And then second person singular is s, third person singular is e, or if there's a vowel and that starts the word following this ending, it's n with that nu on the end. In the first person plural, we have amen. In the second person plural, ete. And in the third person plural, on, omicron nu again. So imperfect might look a little bit funky, but you might also be thinking, this looks somewhat familiar. The only thing that's really new are these first and third person endings, the first person singular and third person plural. And what's great about this is they match each other. So once you learn one, you have the other automatically. What might be looking familiar right now is these endings, and especially these endings, because the first person plural and second person plural endings for imperfect are exactly the same as for present and future. So that's super easy. You already know those endings. And these second and third person singular endings are very, very similar to the present and future endings, because if you remember, the present and future endings are ace and a, respectively, and here we just got rid of the iota. So that's how we ended up with our imperfect endings. So it's pretty straightforward, right? All you've got to know is you take away the iota in the second and third person singular, and you've learned these two new endings for the first person singular and third person plural, and you already knew the first person plural and second person plural endings. So imperfect in terms of endings is really not too bad. You've just got a couple new ones to learn and a couple iota subtractions, I guess you could say, to remember. So that's all for imperfect endings. Now we get into what's a little bit harder, the temporal augment. So there are a few rules we're going to have to learn, and I know that these charts might look a little bit overwhelming, but we'll go over all of them and it'll all make sense. So first, these augments are used at the front of verbs in the imperfect tense. So in general, imperfect isn't too bad because, okay, like I said, we've learned our endings already. So let's look at a word we already know. How about paideuo? So far, we would take paideuo, and we already know that because the imperfect is based on our present stem, we just look for our present stem by taking off the ending, so that's the omega, so we can erase that and replace with our new imperfect first person singular ending. One thing you want to make sure to catch is that because this omicron is short, we have to move our accent to its appropriate position. So as usual, we want to start on that last syllable over our last vowel, and we have paide-won right now. That's not correct, we know that, and because the omicron is short, we're going to go back 2 syllables, so 1, 2. And remember that the I diphthong, the alpha iota, is proper because there's no macron on the alpha, so we can put our accent on the second vowel in the diphthong. So we end up with paide-won. Now, that is not totally correct for imperfect because there's one more thing we have to add. So before you write your full imperfect verb, you always want to add an epsilon. And I know that looks a little bit weird, but that's just how imperfect works. And you'd be thinking, well, wouldn't I just recognize an imperfect verb off the bat then because you just see a bunch of epsilons in front of words? Not exactly. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. When you have a vowel that starts a verb in Greek, I almost said Latin, then you're going to need to change that vowel based on how the vowel would combine with an epsilon. And this isn't exactly straightforward, there are just a couple rules you've got to learn. So this alpha, for example, that we have here. Alpha plus epsilon, I guess, turns into an eta. So instead of writing alpha epsilon, because that's not a diphthong or anything, you're going to just write eta in front of the word. So for the example's sake, just imagine that this was a paide-won. This would instead be not a paide-won, but a paide-won. But obviously, paidewo is a word on its own, so we just stick with the simple epsilon rule. So remember, any word that starts with a consonant, unless there's a preposition, which I'll explain in a little bit, you're just going to stick an epsilon on the front. For these augment rules, like I said, if you have an alpha and you combine it with the eta, it turns into, if you combine the alpha with the epsilon, it turns into an eta. Or an easier way to think of it is if you see a word that starts with alpha, just replace the alpha with an eta. Then for alpha iota diphthong, you end up with eta with an iota subscript. Makes sense, right? You already learned alpha turns into eta, so alpha iota would likely turn into alpha iota into eta with an iota subscript. Then for epsilon, that also turns into eta, so pretty nifty there. And probably, as you would suspect at this point, epsilon iota turns into eta with an iota subscript. Or it could also be epsilon iota as is. But I personally prefer to think of it as, for consistency's sake, as just eta with an iota subscript. But if you were to see this in a sentence, a verb starting with epsilon iota, that could very well be imperfect. All right, let's move on to some new combinations. Alpha upsilon turns into eta upsilon, or it can stay the same. Epsilon upsilon turns into eta upsilon also, or it can stay the same as epsilon upsilon. Omicron turns into omega, right? And that makes sense because in general, this augment means we're lengthening the vowel. We have this short omicron. So if we're lengthening an omicron, an O sound, it would make sense that we would just make it an omega, which is already a long O, rather than adding any other letters. And this also follows our earlier rule where we had alpha turns into eta, and then alpha iota turns into eta with an iota subscript, or same thing with epsilon, and epsilon iota into eta with an iota subscript. Here it's basically the same thing, just with omega. So omicron turned into regular omega, so omicron iota is going to turn into omega with an iota subscript. Makes sense, right? Once you get the hang of this, it starts to flow a little bit more easily. Then these last two are super easy because you just take your iota and you add a macron, just like you would in Latin to lengthen a vowel. And same thing with upsilon, you just add a macron, and then you're good to go. So I personally find that the hardest ones to remember are these two. But once you've got those, you're pretty good to go, because all you've got to remember, alpha to eta, and then once you add an iota, that is just going to become an eta with an iota subscript. Same thing with epsilon. Epsilon just goes to eta. Epsilon with an iota becomes eta with an iota subscript. Omicron to omega. Omicron iota just becomes omega with an iota subscript. And then these two, like I said, are really easy. Iota just becomes iota with a macron, and upsilon becomes upsilon with a macron. And then you just look at these last two tricky ones. Alpha upsilon becomes eta upsilon, and epsilon upsilon becomes eta upsilon also. And these become even easier once you've learned your earlier rules, because you might notice our alpha already turned into eta. So this alpha is already turning into eta on its own. The upsilon is just kind of there for kicks. Same thing over here. The epsilon is already turning into eta, and the epsilon here is also turning into eta. So if you just ignore those upsilons on the end, you've already learned the rule. All you've got to do is remember to add the upsilon back on once you've augmented your alpha and your epsilon. So not too bad, right? I know that these rules are a little bit overwhelming, but once you've got them down, this will all come a lot easier. These rules will also be down below in the practice worksheet, along with a bunch of practice problems for you to do, and along with your vocab as usual. So let's move on to some practice. So here we have a word that we've already seen before, prato. And prato means to do or act. We learned that a couple lessons back. So now let's try to make it imperfect. We're going to start by putting on our augment, or really our epsilon on the front. Because here, prato starts with a consonant, so all we've got to do is add that epsilon. No, none of those rules we just spent time going over. So far we have eprato. And this has a smooth breathing mark, because it's not heprato. And so far, we had our accent on the end, and we moved it back one syllable because that omega is long. So we have eprato now. And now, all we've got to do is add our ending. So we find our stem by taking off our present ending. We end up with eprat. And now we're going to add our imperfect ending that we learned earlier. So now we have epraton. Not too bad, right? And now let's go through the entire form. So, first person singular. Epraton. Oh, sorry, I messed up our accent. I didn't notice to change that. You see how easy it is? Okay, let's start back at the beginning so we don't continue to mess this up. We put our accent on the last syllable, and that omicron, like we always know, is short, so we're going to move back 2 syllables. That was my bad. So, now we know that our accent goes here, and we can move on to second person singular. So now we have eprat s, right? No iota. Iota would mean that we're either in the present or in the future, depending on what's going on here. And again, we have smooth breathing, and that epsilon is short, so we're going back 2 spaces, and we end up here. Eprates. All right, and then our third person singular, we have eprat e. Don't know why that epsilon looks so weird. E. And we're going to go smooth breathing, and that epsilon on the end is short again, so back 2 spaces, 2 syllables, and we end up with eprate. And on to the plural. Now things are super easy for us because we've already learned everything. That's right. Epratomen. Smooth breathing. Our epsilon is short on the end, so we're going to move back 2 syllables for our accent. So epratomen. Epratete. Smooth breathing, epsilon short on the end, so back 2 syllables to epratete. And then, third person plural, probably the easiest one, just matches our first person singular. So epraton. See, not too bad. Just got to learn those new endings and our augments. And here it was super easy because we could just add an epsilon. Now let's do an example that is a little bit harder. Here is a word we have somewhat looked at before. So we learned lepo on its own, means to abandon or leave behind. Apo, added on the front, just means exactly the same thing. Just emphasizes it a little bit more. So here we're going to talk about what happens when you have a prefix on a word. Here, our prefix is apa, and as we know, it doesn't really do anything to the meaning of the word necessarily, but it is going to affect our imperfect tense. So based on everything we've learned so far, our augment, because we've noticed that this word begins with a vowel, would be alpha to eta. So we would think, okay, apalepo, right? Just based on everything that we've learned so far, or technically if we add our endings. Apalipon. But it's not quite that simple. Here, we need to look at the last vowel in our prefix. So here we go. The last letter in our prefix, which happens to be omicron, is just going to disappear. And we are going to add in its place an epsilon. So here is how I like to think of what's going on. You take your full word, apalepo, and then you're going to take off that prefix, so separate it. Now think of this as 2 totally separate words, just for the time being. Normally, we would just add an epsilon on the front, and then change our ending. So now we have apa elepon. But because these 2 are combined, we've got to do something to be able to combine them, because we can't have apoelepon, right? That would just not make sense with everything we've learned so far. Prepositions will just take away that vowel. So we end up with, and we're going to get rid of that breathing mark because now it's just one word, apelepon. I know that might be a little bit scary right now, but it's not too bad as long as I think, at least, you split the word when you're thinking about how to form this imperfect form. Now, if your prefix were to end in a consonant, all you would do is add the epsilon before the actual word. So if this had been op as its own thing, you would just add the epsilon here before lepon, and you'd stick this back on. So you'd actually end up with the same form, but that's just because when you have a vowel at the end of your prefix, it goes away. So vowel at the end of your prefix, you just get rid of it and add the epsilon right there before the base verb. If you have no vowel at the end of the prefix, you add your epsilon before the base verb, you're all good to go. If there is a vowel at the end of the prefix, get rid of the vowel, add your epsilon before the base verb, and then you can start. So now let's start. First person singular. So we've already written it here. Apelepon. Second person singular. Lepes. And then here, let's go through our rules for accenting. Start on the last syllable. Go back. No, let's not do that. Go back 2 syllables. So 1, 2, because that epsilon on the end was short. Now, third person singular. Apelepe. Go back 2 syllables because that epsilon on the end is short again. In the first person plural, we have apelepomen. I know, that's a doozy. Go back to our last syllable. We have that short epsilon, so we go back 2 syllables for our accent. So 1, 2. Apelepomen. And then in the second person plural, apelepete. Go back 2 syllables because our epsilon on the end is short. Apelepete. And then the third person plural, apelepon. Omicron is short on the end. Go back 2 syllables, apelepon. It looks a little bit crazy and hectic, but remember, once you break it down and don't freak out about jumbling this all together all at once, it's really not bad. I would just recommend take the steps you need to, take the time you need to, split the word apart as you need to, do whatever you need so that you're not trying to do this all in one step, because I guarantee that's when you'll get confused. And like I did earlier, I messed up the accent when we were doing our example here because I was trying to go so fast. So just take your time, double check your work, and make sure it all makes sense to you. And speak it too, because I find that that really helps solidify ideas for me. All right, that's all that we have for the actual lesson. Now let's just learn a couple of vocab words. First, we have Lego, which I forgot to put an accent on clearly. So Lego is to say or tell. This is one of those words that has a really strange future and actually has 2 possible forms. The one we would expect is lexo, right? Because that gamma there would change into xe when we make it future and combine it with the sigma. If you need a little refresher on that, you can go back a couple lesson videos and find the future tense video. Lego also has this strange looking future form, arrow. I think it's really cool, but all you gotta do is memorize it as a weird form. And then our next word is fugo, which means to flee. Looks like fugo in Latin, so that's how I remember that one. It can also mean to avoid or to be in exile. And in the future, also has a weird future, it's pheuxomai. And you might be thinking, what in the world is that ending? That is actually a middle or passive ending. Here it's middle, so it keeps its middle endings even in the future tense. And we'll be learning middle next week, so you'll recognize that form and understand how to use it in general too. And now, let's look at some nouns. First, aletheia. This means truth. So it's just another noun to know, but it can also mean, in an adverbial sense, truly, when it's put in the dative. So here we have te aletheia, and we've combined it with the feminine article, and we end up with truly, or in truth, really is an easy way to think about it, because we know the dative can be translated as in something. Here it's in an adverbial sense, so in truth, truly, really, any of those. Our next noun is thanatos, uha. It means death. And this little weird note that I put just means that when you see a capital theta at the start of this word, it means death as in the capital sense. I guess as the personified god death, if that makes sense. And then our last noun is kindunos, uha, which means danger or risk. And then just one adjective to learn this week is philos, aeon, and it takes a dative and means dear to. So it can something dear to someone, sort of like carus in Latin. And if you use it substantively, technically is what's happening here, it can mean friend. Although the book that I'm using defines philos and philae, the masculine and feminine forms, as their own nouns. But really what's happening is that philos, the adjective, is being used as a substantive. But that makes sense, because if something's dear to you, then as a personified adjective, as a noun, then they would likely be your friend, I would hope. And then for conjunctions, we just have one, which is de, or we've seen this sort of thing before. If there's a vowel that starts the next word, then you get rid of that epsilon and you put an apostrophe. So it's just d, and then connects with the vowel that starts the next word. And this means and or but. And this little pp that I put in parentheses, I'm using to designate that it's post-positive. So post-positive, if you don't know what it means that you're taking this word, de, and putting it after the word that it accompanies. So if there's a noun and then you want to put de with it, you're going to put de after that noun. That's what post-positive means, and you'll see it in a couple other words we have coming. So particles, our first one is men, which means indeed, and it is also post-positive. And then we have un, which means therefore, and again it's post-positive. So if you're saying therefore the man, un anthropos, you would actually say anthropos un, the man therefore. Wouldn't really change your translation in English, you could translate it either way. But in Greek, when you're writing it, you're going to want to put this word after whatever word it's technically going with. You don't want to see it at the start of a sentence, in other words. Now, there are some correlatives. We learned what correlatives were in one of our very first lessons when we had kai, which means both and. Here, we're using these two new words that we learned, men and de. So men, followed by blah, 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 and then de, blah, 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 means on the one hand, blah, 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 on the other, blah, blah, blah. There are other words that do this in Latin, so you may be familiar with those. And here in Greek, we're using, like I just said, men, de. And if you add the article beforehand, ha men, ha de, you can translate this a number of ways. It could be on the one hand, on the other, but it could also be translated as this one, that one, the other, and in the plural, some others. Pretty logical. What's important to understand here is that you can't just use the ha masculine article for any noun, right? That wouldn't make sense, because if you have a feminine noun or a neuter noun following this ha men, you're not going to be using ha with that noun. If the men weren't there, you wouldn't want to stick a ha before the noun. So you got to think of it that way. You've got to be able to imagine that this men and this de are disappearing just for the time being, and make sure that your article matches the noun that's coming. We'll see that in the sentence that I used for the teaser. So here we are, at the very end of the lesson, onto our teaser for next week. This sentence, I'm not really sure if it makes sense in terms of context for what might be happening here, but I thought it was a nice example, and I stuck together some words that I thought we could use to really solidify what we learned today. So, he men adelphe, kindunon, ephelge, ha de thesauros lepetai. Okay, so pretty long sentence for what we've been doing in the past, right? Let's break it down. We'll start with this he men adelphe. We know that the he goes with adelphe, right? And we've already learned adelphe, it means sister. And we've learned this he men. As soon as we see that, we should be thinking, oh, is there a day coming later? And yes, there is. So we know that these are going to go together. And then we found our verb in this first half of the sentence. And let's see if we can find our verb in the second half. Lepetai. It's okay if you could not recognize that. It's an ending that we have not learned, to be fair. But we should be able to recognize this lep beginning. And with this, we should be able to recognize this form at this point because of what we learned today. And we should note that sauros is a noun. So by process of elimination, I guess you could say, you could figure out right now that this is the verb. And then we have an object in the first half of our sentence. And we have a different subject in our second half. So I'm going to highlight these as subjects. I don't really know what's going on with the color coordination here, but you know what? We're going with it. And now let's put this together. So we'll start at the beginning. He men adelphe. So on the one hand, the sister, ephelge. So what does this look like? We see that epsilon on the front, and we should immediately think imperfect. And we can check by looking at our ending, and yes, that is an imperfect ending. It's third person singular, right? Because on se. So ephelge matches with our subject. So great. Now we have, on the one hand, the sister was fleeing. Kindunon. This is danger. We learned this a little while. Actually, didn't we just learn this today? Let's check. Yes, we learned this today. So if you didn't recognize that word, that's okay. We just learned it. Means danger. So on the one hand, the sister was fleeing danger. Hade, on the other, thesauros, the treasure. And let's stop for a second and recognize that this here before the de is ha, because thesauros is masculine. So we needed the masculine article, whereas we had he here to match with adelphe. So ha thesauros. On the other hand, the treasure, lepetai. So, lepetai. This ending, this tai, or really the etai, is middle or passive. They have the same endings. And you really have to be able to tell, based on what's going on in the sentence, whether middle or passive makes more sense. And I think that'll make more sense as we do examples next week. You don't know what middle means right now, and I don't think we should be loading that on for a teaser, so I'm just going to tell you right now that this is passive. So, passive works the same way in Greek as it does in Latin. It just means something is being done by or to someone. So here, the treasure is being lepo. What is lepo? To be abandoned, right? Or left behind. So here with this passive ending, the treasure is left behind. And this is not imperfect. We don't see any sort of epsilon or any weird ending on the end. So now let's put it all together and we'll be done for the week. On the one hand, the sister was fleeing danger. On the other, the treasure is left behind. All right, that is all for this week. I know this was a ton of information to shove in one lesson, but there's a lot of examples down below in the practice worksheet. I encourage you to check them out. Make sure to reach out to me if you have any questions. My contact info is always down below in the description. I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you next week for some middle and passive endings.